A police officer showed up at my door, bringing my wife in handcuffs. His expression was completely different from anything I had ever seen before. There was no trace of shame, just a blank, desperate look. "Sir, we need to talk. Your wife is being arrested for..." The officer's voice echoed as he spoke the words that would change my life forever. It was a scenario I had never imagined. The woman I swore to spend the rest of my life with, who slept next to me every night, now had her hands tied, eyes staring at the floor, as if avoiding facing the truth, or maybe the truth. "Me," the officer continued, "and she is also accused of treason, both to you and to the law." My heart sank. "What do you mean, betrayal?" I could only think of one thing: running away, leaving everything behind. The ground seemed to disappear beneath my feet as reality crushed me. And then the officer's next words were like a stab: "I'm sorry, sir, but we need you to come to the station. There is more to be clarified, about her crimes." Crime? Was she involved in something illegal? I couldn't believe it. The world was spinning, and my marriage, all the love we had built, all the memories, was turning to dust, being carried away by the merciless wind of truth. I tried hard to process everything, but it seemed impossible. The woman I loved, who I trusted blindly, was now a criminal. And what's more, a traitor. Tears came to my eyes, but shame and anger held them back. I couldn't show weakness at that moment, not in front of that police officer, and definitely not in front of her. For the next few minutes, it felt like I was trapped in a bad movie. The police car's lights flashed in front of me, and she was inside, with her head pressed against the glass, avoiding looking at me. When we finally locked eyes, there was only emptiness. So many years together, so many shared moments, and now I was a stranger. Why did she do this to me? Why did you do this to our family? I couldn't stop my mind from going back to all the signs I ignored. Those urgent phone calls at night, the text messages she answered silently, the strange perfume on her clothes. I trusted her blindly, to the point where I believed anything she said was the truth. What an idiot I was. And yet, even now, with all the evidence before me, there was a part of me that wanted to deny it, scream, run to her and ask, why? Why did she destroy everything? "You're an honest man, I imagine," said the policeman as he led me out. "So it must be difficult to hear that your wife was involved with another man, and with crimes. She helped him." My stomach dropped. Not only did she have another one, did she help this other one in crimes? My hands shook with anger. What had she done? And, most importantly, who was this man? The ride to the police station was a blur. The policeman's words swirled in my mind. The accusations, the arrest, the betrayal. This all felt like a huge bad joke, as if at any moment someone was going to jump in front of me and say it was a prank. But it wasn't. When we arrived at the police station, everything became even darker. I was taken to a small room, where an investigator was waiting for me. He introduced himself quickly, but his words hit me like a punch in the gut. "Your wife is involved in something serious," he said. "Do you know this man?" He pushed a photo towards me. I had never seen that face before. But even if I didn't know who he was, at that moment I already knew enough. My wife's lover. The reason why she had distanced herself from me in the last few months, the reason for so many lies. And the worst, the man she was committing crimes with. I needed to know everything, but the investigator seemed reluctant to share more details. "We are investigating," he said. "But you need to know that, she's in a difficult position. And you, as a husband, can get involved in this, even if you don't want to." It was as if, with each new word I heard, a little more of my life was ripped away from me. It wasn't enough to have been betrayed, deceived and exposed, now I was linked to crimes I didn't even know existed. The shame of being associated with that consumed me. All the eyes at the police station seemed to imprint on me the mark of a betrayed man, of a fool who didn't know what was happening under his own roof. I just wanted to get out of there, get away from all that mess, but I knew it wouldn't be that easy. The investigator asked more questions. About our routine, marriage, about possible, behavioral changes. I slowly realized that the case was much deeper than simple betrayal. It was about lies, secrets, and choices she made, choices I could never participate in. At the end of the conversation, the investigator gave me a look of pity. "I'm sorry for you," he said sincerely. "You seem like a good man, no one deserves to go through this." The police officer who took me there approached, indicating that I was free to go. But my mind was still stuck on that photo, on that unfamiliar face that had somehow destroyed everything I believed in. On the way home, each step seemed to weigh me down more. What would I do now? How would I face the humiliation, the shame, and the uncertain future? And most of all, how would I face the truth about the woman I loved? And so the night came, cold and unforgiving. Alone, in the darkness of our empty room, there was only one question left pounding in my mind: why did she do this to me? Why did you throw away everything we had? The answers were still far away, hidden in the shadows of a past that, until then, I thought I knew so well. But now, everything was about to change. I had no idea that the worst was yet to come. Welcome to the channel, where we explore intense stories of love and betrayal. Here, we do not support or tolerate any type of infidelity. The stories told are fictional, but they carry a powerful message. Betrayal destroys lives, breaks hearts, and leaves marks that no one should bear. So get ready, because what you are about to hear is a shocking story, full of twists and turns and raw emotions. Fasten your seatbelts and enjoy this impactful journey. James has always been a dedicated man. Dedicated to his family, his work, and, most importantly, the woman he loved, Sarah. Ever since they met, when they were still young, at a party at a mutual friend's house, he felt completely in love. Sarah, with her long brown hair and easy smile, was the type of person who made everyone around her feel at ease, with that sweet yet lively way of her. James fell in love instantly, and for him, it was like finding the missing piece in his life. That woman so vibrant and full of dreams completed him in a way he never imagined possible. And so the years passed. They built a life together, a beautiful house on the outskirts of New Jersey, with a porch that looked out onto a garden that James tended on the weekends. He was proud of each plant, each flower grown with his own hands, saying it was a reflection of the life he and Sarah built together, colorful, harmonious, full of small details that made them happy. James worked as a civil engineer, dedicating hours and hours of his life to the projects he developed with an almost artisanal passion. He was the type of man who woke up before sunrise to have time to review every detail of the drawings and calculations he made. Despite the rush, he always found space for Sarah. He left love notes around the house, surprised her with flowers, and never stopped making a point of telling her how much he loved her. "You are the woman of my life, Sarah," he said, holding her face in his hands as he looked into her eyes, with sincerity and a certainty that did not waver. Sarah, in turn, was an art teacher at a private school. Creative, sensitive and full of energy, she loved sharing her love of painting, sculpture and music with children, who loved her in return. For her, the world was full of possibilities, and life with James seemed perfect, like a painting painted with the most vibrant colors. But, little by little, this perfection began to wear away, without her even realizing it. In recent years, Sarah began to feel restless. It was as if something inside her wasn't complete, a feeling of emptiness she couldn't explain. While James maintained his predictable routine, with his rigid schedule and his unfailing sense of responsibility, Sarah longed for something more. And it was difficult to understand what that something more could be. She often found herself looking out the classroom window at the sky, thinking about what else life could offer, beyond that daily routine that, in some way, imprisoned her. She loved James, there was no doubt about that, but at the same time, there was something pulsing inside her, as if a piece of herself was locked away somewhere, far from her reach. The relationship between them had, in everyone's eyes, the appearance of a solid marriage. When they were together, they seemed to be the perfect couple. Close friends always saw them smiling, hugging, sharing little jokes and stories. But when they were alone, routine sometimes spoke louder. There were nights when James would come home from work exhausted and, after a quiet dinner, collapse on the couch to watch a movie or fall asleep right there. Sarah, on the other hand, had an energy that never seemed to run out. She tried to bring in a new activity for the week, a dance class, a different dinner, but James often refused, tired, saying that they needed to rest and that the work the next day would be hard. These small refusals accumulated in Sarah's heart. There were no explosive arguments, no big fights. It was the silences, the unspoken words, the hugs that seemed more distant. She wanted more, she wanted to feel like she was alive, she wanted to experience new emotions, to feel desired and free, like when she was young. And although she loved James and respected everything he did for them, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing, an adventure, perhaps, or a kind of freedom that she didn't know exactly how to explain. James, on the other hand, was completely oblivious to these feelings. He considered himself the perfect husband, caring, loving, providing. I didn't understand why Sarah seemed so restless sometimes, or why she spent so much time staring into space, lost in thought. To him, their life was good. The marriage was in order, they had a beautiful house, each other, and all he wanted was to keep building this future together, brick by brick, until they grew old and looked back with pride at what they had done. Weekends were sacred. They spent Saturday morning at the local market, buying fresh fruit, artisan bread and flowers. It was a silent ritual that, for James, signified stability and complicity. In the afternoons, Sarah used to paint in the small makeshift studio at the back of the house, while James tended to the garden. Sometimes she called him to see her latest work, and he always praised her, even if he didn't fully understand what that jumble of colors and shapes meant. To him, it was beautiful because it was hers. But over the past few months, James began to notice something was different. Sarah seemed more distracted, more distant. She started leaving the house alone more often, saying she needed to go for a walk or have some time to herself. He tried to ask her what was going on, if she was okay, but she always replied that she was just tired, needing time to recharge her energy. "It's just a woman's thing, James," she said, giving a smile that didn't seem genuine. And he believed. After all, why would I doubt it? One night, while they were having dinner together, Sarah suggested that perhaps they could take a trip, something spontaneous, to get out of the routine. James, with his practical mind, pondered the cost, the work he had to do, all the responsibilities that needed to be taken into consideration. "Maybe another time," he said, trying not to disappoint her. "Everything is so busy now, let's plan for a few months from now, who knows?" She just nodded, but he didn't see the silent disappointment in her eyes, nor the tired sigh that came after. She didn't want to plan, she didn't want to wait. Sarah wanted to live. "I wanted to feel that the world was bigger than that comfortable house, bigger than that stable marriage." She wanted something more. And, without realizing it, at that moment, a small fissure opened between the two. Over time, these fissures would become deeper, and the perfect life they had built together would slowly begin to crumble. But for now, James still believed that everything was okay, that their love was unwavering. And Sarah, well, Sarah just kept going, trying to ignore the emptiness that was growing inside her, hoping that one day it would disappear, or that someone would help her fill it. What none of them knew was that a storm was about to hit their lives. A storm that would come without warning, sweeping everything and everyone into its path, and forever transforming the world they thought they knew so well. James noticed that something was changing in Sarah. There were little things he couldn't understand, a message she quickly hid, a sudden departure to take care of something at school, and that nagging feeling that her head was always somewhere else. The art studio, which had once been her refuge, now felt empty, as if she no longer wanted to spend time there. When he asked, she just smiled and said everything was fine, but the smile didn't reach her eyes. Sarah's restlessness grew more and more each day, but James believed it was just a phase. That's when Sarah's returns started to become more frequent. She said she needed space, time for herself, and James, trying to be understanding, didn't insist. It was always the same excuse: meeting friends, having a coffee, seeing an exhibition in the city. He didn't quite understand why these activities never included him, but he respected her space, believing that time alone could help her find the peace she seemed to have lost. Deep down, however, anxiety gnawed at him. The fear that something was wrong, that he was losing his wife little by little, grew every day, but he had no proof, just an intuition that he preferred to ignore. It was on a Friday night that things started to fall apart. Sarah had left work early, saying she needed to take care of something important. James found the lack of detail strange, but he trusted her. He planned to surprise her for dinner, bought ingredients to prepare her favorite dish and spent a lot of time in the kitchen, looking forward to seeing her smile when she arrived and saw everything ready. But the clock ticked, the hours passed, and nothing from Sarah. He called her cell phone several times, but it always went to voicemail. When he finally heard the front door open, it was almost midnight. Sarah entered the house with a tired smile, but too happy for someone who said she had had a long day at work. She wore a perfume that James didn't recognize, a sweet fragrance, different from what he was used to smelling. And suddenly, something clicked inside him. He tried to stay calm, tried to believe he was just imagining things, but he could no longer ignore the growing discomfort in his chest. "Are you okay, Sarah?" he asked, trying to sound casual, but the tone of his voice betrayed concern. "Why didn't you answer my calls? Was everything okay?" She hesitated, clearly surprised by the interrogation. "Oh, my love, I'm so sorry. I was with the girls, we lost track of time, and the cell phone ran out of battery." She moved closer, trying to kiss him on the cheek, but James pulled away slightly. It wasn't like her to act like that. It wasn't normal to smell that strange smell, that anxious tone in her voice. And why wasn't she looking directly at him? In the following days, James became a shadow, trying to disguise his growing distrust. He began to observe every movement, every message, every excuse she made. I didn't want to confront her, fearing that she would be upset by his lack of trust, but I felt like I needed to find out what was going on. So one night, when she said she was going to an alumni gathering, yet another of the many engagements that had come up in recent months, James made a decision: he would go after her. It felt strange for him to act like this, almost as if he was betraying his own trust. But at that moment, he needed to know. He followed Sarah through the city, hiding in the shadows and trying to keep his distance. She entered a fancy restaurant, different from the places she usually went to, and he saw her inside, laughing and talking to someone. He couldn't see clearly who it was, but what he saw was enough to confirm his worst fear: Sarah wasn't alone. There was a man with her, a stranger, who smiled and touched her in a way she never allowed when she was with James. He froze. His head spun and his hands shook as he watched that scene. This couldn't be happening. Not with him, not with the woman he loved. The woman he thought knew better than himself. Every laugh Sarah gave was like a dagger piercing James' chest. He wanted to go in, wanted to confront her right there, but something stopped him. It was as if, in doing so, he had to acknowledge the reality he refused to accept. After that night, James couldn't sleep anymore. "I couldn't eat anymore." The smell of the strange perfume still seemed to be in the house, and he no longer knew what was real and what was a figment of his imagination. He needed answers, but he knew Sarah wouldn't be honest. She had been lying to him for months, and he had no idea what to make of it. Why was she doing this? Who was that man? And most of all, how had he not noticed before? Until finally, one Saturday afternoon, the bomb exploded. James was sitting in the living room, staring at the blank television screen, when he heard a loud knock on the door. When he opened it, he found 2 police officers and Sarah, handcuffed, with her face covered in tears. "Mr. James," asked one of the police officers, "your wife has been arrested. We need to take her." Everything seemed to happen in slow motion. The cop's words, Sarah's terrified expression, the handcuffs glinting in the sunlight. Nothing made sense, nothing had logic. He tried to process what was happening, but the words seemed to pass through his ears like a gust of wind. Arrested? For what? What is happening? It was at that moment that everything became clear. Sarah was cheating on James. And what's more, there was much more to that betrayal than he could ever imagine. But there was still a secret hidden in the shadows, a secret that would change everything. And James was no closer to figuring out what was coming. James looked at Sarah, handcuffed, trying to process everything. It was as if the perfect life he thought he had built was being deconstructed before his eyes. He went to the police station, unable to understand how his wife could have been arrested like that, but he knew that once he got there, the truth would come out. The police station waiting room felt suffocating. The gray concrete walls, the cold lights, everything seemed to tighten James' chest. He could barely breathe as he waited for someone to say something, anything that would clarify the reason for Sarah's arrest. After minutes that felt like hours, a detective appeared, calling him into a small interrogation room. The tension was almost unbearable, and he wanted to scream, demand answers, but the fear of hearing the truth kept him silent. "Mr. James," the detective began, his voice firm and tired. "I understand this must all be very confusing for you, but your wife, Sarah, was arrested for more than just adultery. She is involved in very serious crimes. We need you to understand that, at this point, she is complicit in a larger scheme." James stood still, trying to absorb those words. Crimes? Adultery was more than he could handle, but crimes? He tried to remain calm, but his voice was shaky. I don't understand. What crimes are you talking about? I know my wife, she is not a criminal. This must be a mistake. The detective took a deep breath and looked into James' eyes. "I'm afraid it's not a mistake. His wife was having an affair with a man named Nicholas Perez. Do you know him?" Nicholas. James could hardly believe what he was hearing. He had never heard that name before. Nicholas. Was it the man he had seen at the restaurant? The man who had stolen Sarah from him? The detective continued, "Nicholas is a known criminal to authorities. He is suspected of involvement in a series of financial frauds, money laundering and document trafficking. And from what we know, his wife was involved in this. She provided confidential information, helped to forge documents. She knew what she was doing, Mr. James." James' head swam. The woman he had shared his life with, who he thought he knew better than anyone, was betraying him not just emotionally but legally. And most disturbingly, she was involved with a dangerous criminal. How did he not notice any of this? How could you be so blind? Every bit of that information was like a sharp blade piercing his heart. He could barely speak, but the words finally came out, as if they had a life of their own. "Can I talk to her? Please. I need to hear from her. I need to understand." The detective nodded, but his look was full of pity. "Of course. Let's take him to her cell. But I advise you to remain calm. This conversation will not be easy." As he walked through the cold hallways of the police station, James tried to prepare himself for what was coming. But how can anyone prepare to hear a confession of a lifetime of lies? When he arrived at the cell, he saw her. Sarah was sitting in the corner, head down, her hair covering her face. When she heard the footsteps approaching, she looked up, and their eyes met. For a brief moment, it was as if nothing had changed, it was just the two of them, like so many other times. But now there were metal bars between them, and a truth impossible to ignore. "Sarah," James' voice was choked, almost a whisper. "Please, tell me this is all a mistake. Tell me, that none of this is true." She looked at him, her eyes full of tears, but there was a certain coldness there. A distance he had never seen before. James. I'm so sorry. I never wanted you to find out like this, I never wanted to hurt you. So it's true. James's voice rose, full of pain and anger. You were cheating on me, and you're still involved in crimes? How could you do this to me? How could you do this to us? Sarah tried to get up, but the handcuffs prevented her from moving freely. It wasn't supposed to be like this, she said, her voice low and shaky. I got involved with Nicholas without knowing what I was getting into. At first, he was just a friend. Someone who understood me, who made me feel alive. But then, things got complicated. He asked me for help with some things. He said it was something simple, that there was no problem. I swear I didn't know it was illegal in the beginning, James. And when I realized it, I was already too involved to leave. Are you saying you fell in love with him? James' anger was palpable, his voice firm and desperate. You risked everything, for him. It wasn't love, James, Sarah replied, closing her eyes tightly, as if the words were too painful to say. It was an escape. I felt trapped. Stuck in this life, in this routine. And he gave me something different. I know it sounds crazy, but I couldn't stop. And when I saw it, I was so involved that, there was no way out. And I never thought it would hurt you like this. I thought I could keep these two lives separate. James held on to the bars of his cell, trying to understand, but nothing made sense. Nothing could justify what she had done. You lied to me, Sarah. 4 months. You made me believe that everything was okay. And you put our lives at risk. What did you expect? That I would never find out? That you would continue to live this life forever? She looked at him, her face racked with guilt and despair. I don't know what I expected. I was lost. I was so lost, James. And now, I've lost everything. The silence that followed was crushing. James felt like he was falling off a cliff, with no ground to catch him. The woman he loved had destroyed everything, their marriage, their trust, their life together. He didn't know what to do, where to go. And as he stared at her, all he wanted to know was, why? Why did she betray him so deeply? But he knew he would never find an answer that satisfied him. Finally, the detective approached, interrupting the moment. Mr. James, we need to take her to give a statement. We will need your cooperation later. Sorry. James nodded, still in shock, and was led out of the cell. When he looked back, Sarah was crying, her face pressed against her cuffed hands. He wanted to scream, he wanted to say that he hated her, that he never wanted to see her again. But all he could do was turn around and leave. The rain was falling outside, and he walked aimlessly, the sound of the drops echoing in the void of his mind. He knew this story wasn't over yet. There was something more, something that hadn't yet been said. And, no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the feeling that the worst was yet to come. James left the police station aimlessly. The rain ran down his face, mixing with the tears he couldn't contain. His mind was a mess, anger, pain, shame, despair, all mixed together in a tight knot. With every step he took, Sarah's words echoed in his head, bringing to the surface all the emotions he tried to bury. He felt betrayed, but also lost. It was as if the entire floor of his life had been ripped out from under his feet. The house, once her refuge, now felt empty, cold. The walls that once told a love story now seemed to suffocate. He wandered through the rooms, looking at old photos, at the studio where Sarah used to paint, at the bed where they slept together. Everything seemed like a distant scene from a life that was no longer his. James fell onto the couch, unable to process the weight of the betrayal and revelation of Sarah's crimes. The night brought with it even darker thoughts. James knew Sarah was in trouble. And, no matter how angry he was at her, no matter how much he wanted to forget her and move on, he couldn't turn off the feeling of love he still had for her. After all, there were years of life together, of promises, of shared dreams. How could he just erase all that? But how could he, at the same time, forgive her for destroying everything he believed in? The emotional betrayal was already devastating, but the fact that she was involved in crimes made it even worse. And yet, there he was, alone in that house, desperately wanting to understand. Over the next few days, James went to the police station several times. Not to see Sarah, but to try to understand the extent of the crimes she was involved in. The detective, although friendly, was direct. Nicholas Perez was a dangerous criminal, and Sarah had provided information and documents that helped in a fraud scheme. But there was a moral question that gnawed at James. Was Sarah completely aware of what she was doing? Or was it just a trick manipulated by Nicholas? He couldn't say, and it tormented him. Because if she had been manipulated, used, maybe he could forgive her, maybe he could help her find a way back. But if she had done everything consciously, knowing what she was putting at risk, it would have been an irreparable mistake. It was then that James was called to testify as a witness in Sarah's case. When he arrived at the police station, his heart weighed tons. He knew that this would be the turning point, that after this testimony, there would be no going back. He would have to decide whether to help Sarah or give her up completely. The moral dilemma haunted him: support the woman he loved and who had betrayed his trust in every way possible, or help justice do its job and convict her for the crimes she committed? While waiting to be called, James thought about everything that united them. The happy memories, the years of marriage, the dreams they once had. But those thoughts were constantly interrupted by the image of Sarah in handcuffs, wrapped up in Nicholas, hiding the truth from him for so long. The betrayal was not just against him, but against everything they had built. He wondered how she felt now, if she was sorry, if she hated herself for what she had done, or if she was simply afraid of being found out. And there was another question he couldn't shake: if he had been in her place, what would he have done? Finally, he was called to the deposition room. He sat in the cold chair, and the lawyer handling the case looked at him, a serious expression on his face. "Mr. James, you have complete freedom to say what you know about your wife's involvement in these crimes. All information is valuable for the investigation. But we also want to know your perspective. Do you believe she fully knew what she was doing?" James looked at the lawyer, then at the table in front of him. He needed to decide, right then and there. The woman he loved had made terrible mistakes, but a part of him still wanted to believe that she was innocent, that she had been deceived, manipulated by Nicholas. He could help clear her name, fight to prove she was the victim of a larger scheme. But what if she was just lying, trying to use her compassion to escape the consequences? How could he know? James began hesitantly, the words weighing like lead. I don't know if Sarah was completely aware of what she was doing. I know she was unhappy, that she was looking for something that would make her feel alive. But I also know that she lied to me, for months. I don't know what to believe anymore. The lawyer nodded, taking notes, but said nothing. James continued, now more firmly. I want justice to be done. I want the truth to come out. But I also want, for her to have a chance. A chance to explain himself. To tell what really happened. The session ended, and James returned home, still caught up in his moral dilemma. On the one hand, he wanted to get away from Sarah, cut all ties and move on. On the other, there was still a glimmer of hope, a small voice saying that maybe, just maybe, he could find a way to understand and forgive. He knew that he would soon have to make a decision. And that decision would change the course of their lives forever. In the days that followed, James received a letter from Sarah. A single sheet, handwritten, full of scribbled words stained by tears. She said she was sorry, that she never wanted to hurt him, that she had been a fool to get involved with Nicholas and that she was willing to face all the consequences of her actions. He apologized for having destroyed their lives, for having made James go through all that humiliation and pain. And, at the end, a request: please forgive me. I know I don't deserve it, but if I can find a place in your heart to forgive me, I will fight every day to be worthy of that forgiveness. James held the letter in his hands, feeling the weight of each word. He knew that no matter what happened, that decision would have to be made soon. He would need to choose between love and justice, between truth and forgiveness. And as he sat there in the empty room, he felt like the final storm was approaching, and all he could do was wait. James made the decision to attend Sarah's trial. He arrived at court that day, driven by a desperate need to see with his own eyes the end of the story that had turned his world upside down. When she entered the room, escorted by police officers, she looked like a completely different woman, haggard, her eyes empty, dull. The weight of the crimes, the betrayal, all the lies told, seemed to have destroyed her. And yet, upon seeing her, James couldn't help but feel a mixture of compassion and sadness. This was the woman he had loved for so long, even if now she was just a shadow of her former self. The trial was quick, and the evidence against Sarah was overwhelming. There were call records, forged documents, financial transactions, a whole web of criminal actions that she had, in some way, helped to build. Nicholas Perez, the man who dragged Sarah into that world of crime, did not appear in court. He had fled, disappeared as if he had never existed. The last betrayal he could commit, leaving Sarah to pay for all his sins. As the judge read the sentence, James tried to find some comfort in the harsh words that sounded through the room. She was sentenced to 3 years in prison for complicity in the crimes, with the possibility of a reduction for good behavior. When the verdict was given, Sarah did not cry. She just lowered her head, resigned, as if she already knew that this would be the inevitable outcome. There were no more excuses, no more lies to tell. After the trial, James saw her one last time as she was taken away to prison. She stopped in front of him, her eyes now meeting his, filled with guilt and remorse. "I know you'll never forgive me, James," she said, her voice weak, almost a whisper. "But please, know that I never meant to hurt you. I was foolish, selfish, and I know I will pay for it. I just want you to move on, be happy, find someone who really deserves you." James nodded, swallowing the words that struggled to come out. There was so much he wanted to say, but it all felt empty, useless. The love, the anger, the resentment, the forgiveness, all these feelings were mixed together in a whirlwind, and he knew he would never find a simple answer. "I hope you find peace, Sarah," was all he could say. And in that moment, he knew their story was over. There was nothing more to be said, nothing that could be changed. She was taken away, and he stood there, watching as she disappeared down the cold halls of the courtroom. Time passed, and James had to learn to live with the scars of that relationship. He sold the house where they lived together, changed jobs, and slowly rebuilt his life. He knew that what Sarah had done would never be erased, but he also knew that in order to move forward, he needed to leave the past behind. And so he did. The months of therapy, the friends who supported him, the time spent alone, all of this helped to heal the wounds, one by one. He learned to forgive, not for Sarah, but for himself, so that he could have a future free from the chains of the past. Sarah, in turn, faced life in prison. It was a period of self-knowledge, of regret. She spent her days thinking about the mistakes she made, the choices that led her to where she was. Without Nicholas, without James, she had to face who she really was, stripped of any mask or pretext. During her time in prison, she participated in rehabilitation programs, studied, and wrote letters to James, letters she knew he would probably never read. But those words were for herself, so she could understand who she was and, perhaps, find some kind of redemption. When she was finally released for good behavior, Sarah left prison a different woman. She knew that the life she had before was gone, and that she would need to start over from scratch, alone. She went to another city, found a simple job and began to rebuild her story, away from everything that one day made her lose her way. Years later, James heard about her. A mutual friend commented that she was doing well, living a peaceful life, far from the problems that one day led to her ruin. He felt no anger, no pain. Just a slight feeling of acceptance, as if everything had finally found its place. Meanwhile, Nicolas Perez was never found. He disappeared completely, leaving no trace, and the mystery of his whereabouts remained an unfinished chapter in history. James knew he was responsible for much of the pain he and Sarah went through, but he chose not to spend another second of his life thinking about that man. The justice he sought was not in finding Nicholas, but rather in moving forward and finding peace within himself. The end of James and Sarah's story is, perhaps, a reminder that no matter how devastating a betrayal, how deep the pain, there is always a chance to start again. But starting over isn't about forgetting, it's about learning to bear the marks, accept mistakes, and find a new path. And, although the betrayal left deep scars, it also gave them both an opportunity to rediscover themselves. And so ends this story of love, betrayal, and rebirth. A story that shows how wrong choices can destroy lives, but also brings a message that there is always the possibility of getting back up and finding a new beginning. If you liked this story, leave your comment below and share your opinion. What would you do in James's place? Do you think he made the right decisions? And don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more stories like this, fictional, but with real lessons about how betrayal can transform lives forever. Always remember, here, we do not support any type of betrayal. Betrayal hurts, destroys, and leaves marks that never disappear. Until the next story.